Hello friends, this is Marilyn again from tarotclarity.com, and this is the third video in the mini-series, I guess you could call it, of looking at the Triumph or Trump cards of a variety of decks to see how they may vary your interpretation based on what's in the image. Now, to the left, we're using the Lo Scarabeo Visconti Sforza deck, or the Visconti tarots. I'm using it. I have better examples of the Sforza cards, but this one fits in size with the others. For representation of the TDM, I'm using the Artisan. For some Italian decks, I'm using the Sopraffina from Il Meneghello and the Perrin by Giordano Berti, their publications. And then for a modern deck, and it's already 100 years old, I'm using an Albano Waite tarot based on the Rider-Waite-Smith deck of 1910. Now, the Hermit is a really interesting character because he started out, if we look at the Visconti Sforza cards, as an old man with an hourglass. We know he's old because he's got a white beard that's very long. The stick he carries, could be a sundial, for the purpose of a sundial, right? During the evening hours, a sundial, isn't possible to use, and so they would use an hourglass to show the passage of time. But during the day, his walking stick could also have served as a device for telling time. I don't think clocks were invented until, the 12 or 1300s. This wasn't that much further beyond that point, 1450-ish, I guess. So seeing people using sundials would not have been out of the ordinary, because although the town may have had a clock, individuals in their homes probably did not. So we have an elderly gentleman with a walking stick that could have been doing double duty for a time measuring device and an hourglass, right? His number is 9. Now traditionally the number has been assigned to 9. The character has been assigned to 9, and 9, marks the passage of time. So he's in keeping with the sense of time moving, right? Now, because of experience and age, he has wisdom, right? Hopefully with time, people become wiser. Now, in the Minchiati Etruria, and I do have my Minchiati Fiorentine as well. Let me pull that one. Give me a second. So I've pulled the Minchiati Etruria, the Hermit for that deck, and the Metelli Hermit, and then the Minchiati Florentine cards. And you'll see quite a different image. In the Minchiati now this one is from, I think let me see the exact date. This is a Lo Scarabeo from 1660. We see the hourglass that's represented with an arrow, the passage of time, numbered as 11, identified in the booklet as the Hermit, and he's got a stag, and the significance of that may have been, I used to know it, but I have forgotten. But it would have been an association with this older gentleman who is impaired in some way, unable to walk without the use of an aid, right? And then in the Metelli, which is from Bologna region, also around 1660, the Hermit is identified without number as someone who is winged and incapacitated with an inability to walk. But then also in the Metelli deck, they have the same back. There's an additional card that looks like has since been adopted when TDM passed through, or when, the Italian decks maybe passed through France. And it looks as though this character right here became the Hermit. And that it could have been something that transitioned from one country to another, a misunderstanding, right, of the card. Maybe they just preferred this image better. And this became, because this wasn't necessarily the Hermit, this had a lantern. And so it looks like the Hermit kind of became a character with a walking stick and a lantern rather than an hourglass. I think that's an interesting thing that happened. I also pulled the Minchiati Florentine. This one is by Il Meneghello. And he also is identified as number 11, not 9, as he is in the Minchiati Etruria. He's also identified with the number 11. You can see it here. As a character with a, impairment, with some kind of stag creature or horned creature. And the hourglass with the arrow for time. Now, isn't it interesting? Because I'm wondering if the number, associated with the Hermit now, the number 9, became that way as a result of printing it in reversed, copying the image, including the number, and then at some point it became number 9. I'm not saying that that's what happened, but it looks like it. And frankly, that looks like an L, that would be 50. However, I think it's an I with a period, and I think that's what they did, because here it's clearly an I. So even though that looks like an XL, that would be 40, I guess. I really don't think that's I don't really think that's the case, because this looks like a period. But at any rate, you can see how it's possible that, the deck, as it transitioned from region to region or country to country, how the figures may have changed a little bit, right? Or, gotten confused. That's a possibility. I don't know. I'm not the scholar in that regard. I can only base it on my own observation. I have a lot of decks and I've spent a lot of hours looking at them. And I just try to come up with, common sense conclusion as to how things might have happened. But please don't believe that, just because I say it is necessarily the truth. It just looks that way to me. Now, with the Soprafino, which is also an Italian deck, as were the Minchiatis, the 2 Minchiatis and the Metelli I showed you, they too seem to have adopted an older gentleman with the cane, not the crutches, and a lamp of some type, right? It no longer an hourglass, although, and then the beard, and then the number 9. So at some point when, by the mid-1800s, when the Italians were continuing to making their decks and refining what a tarot deck meant, they too maybe took a clue from how the French were doing it and thought maybe that was okay, or maybe this was their tradition all along. I don't know. Maybe they came up with it before TDM did, and TDM copied it, but we no longer have copies of those decks, from the Italians, except for the Metelli. I think this is the Metelli, right? Where this was a different character. It's really fascinating. And the Perrin is very similar to the Soprafino. Not too much difference, except that this gentleman has red hair rather than the gray or the white beard. And then we get to the type of hermit of modern times, who doesn't so much look like a wanderer as someone who's standing on the top of a place where others come to see him, where he's lighting the way. He's standing there almost waiting, right? Rather than he who himself is wandering. So I would think that we would probably have minor nuances of differences in their meaning. The reference to time is much more clearly indicated here, whereas here he holds a beacon of light. And these fellows, who were the Hermit, also bear the hourglass. Not this one though. But that he's he's physically impaired. And then this guy, who it seems as though was adapted or adopted to be the Hermit, looked quite different, was a different card altogether. So I'm not exactly sure exactly everything that happened there, but I think that's kind of interesting. Okay, the next card is the Wheel of Fortune. And I think what I'll do when I switch cards now is I'll just pause it and do it so that you don't have to sit through it. Okay, so the Wheel of Fortune, with the Italian decks, most clearly reference Lady Fortuna, Lady Luck. Oh, and this one's quite interesting. Now, this one is the Parentero. She's got like thunder and lightning bolts here. She's got a horn of plenty and a flame. There are no characters on her wheel here, but there are. There's a character in this one. And clearly in the Visconti Sforza decks, we have the idea of sometimes you're on top of the game, you're on top of your game, sometimes you're not, or sometimes, maybe you already have had your moment and it's over, right? This one, just fell from grace. This one is aspiring. So the wheel, if we relate it to Lady Luck, which I do, in the passage of time, is that sometimes, you're on top of the world, sometimes you're not. Everyone's got a time, right? And Lady Fortuna was most definitely a character that medieval and Renaissance people would have recognized and understood the message. Here we have, a different iconography altogether. And on the TDM, the Convert TDM, we have the thought of, the passage of, sometimes you're on top, sometimes you're on the bottom, sometimes you're going up. Well, this isn't on the bottom. He's just descending. So we have no figure on the bottom, which is interesting. And the number 10, coincides with the concept of 10 is a max before you go into double digits. Well, that is the double digit. It's the beginning of the double digits, right? So 10, you've fulfilled whatever, and you're starting over. So once you have 10 of anything, or once 10 appears, it's the idea that you're oversaturated and now there's time for new. Now with number 11 in the Visconti Sforza, and I don't know that the Visconti Sforza had their cards numbered, right? I mean, we've now put numbers on the cards in the order that we understand them to be, but they may have had different subtle differences between regions, But at any rate, this depiction of Fortitude is a man, abusing this poor animal, subduing, this wild beast, as if to say, with fortitude you can accomplish anything, or with, brute strength, anything can be accomplished. Clearly, in real life, he would be no equal to a fierce lion, but this lion has been subdued. With the conver and the TDM, we have a woman who very nonchalantly is either opening the jaws of a lion or closing them. Looks like she's opening them. And it's the same kind of message. Same with these two cards. And same with this one with the addition of a lemniscate over the head. More or less the same thing. Now let me pull the Fortitude cards of these other decks to show you how the image of fortitude, the idea of fortitude, the concept of fortitude was represented but using a different image. So here we have the fortitude, the concept of fortitude or strength represented by a pillar, you know. The pillar may be damaged, but it has stood the test of time. I think there's also, of course, a reference to Samson in or Hercules with the pillars, the pillars that he, with strength, knocked over. So that could also be a reference. There's, of course, references to antiquity, which, we may or may not remember correctly. Okay, so with the Italian 1450-ish deck of the Visconti Sforza Tarot, we have number 12 being represented by a young man being hung in a particular position, hung by the foot with the leg crossing over. He is wide awake. Now, I've discussed this in my video on numerology and, what his origin story is, but it's worth repeating. And I'll probably include the link to my numerology playlist down below, so you could go to that for more in-depth references to the Triumph cards, which I'm really not getting into as much with this. But at any rate, this was the position that someone was given, the consequence someone was given for the crime of theft or treason, or, some very serious thing. He's awake because these images were kind of like wanted posters, This guy, who we can clearly identify who he is, so he had to be awake, is wanted or will be punished by death for the crime, or maybe he wouldn't die. I don't know what their rules were. But in any event, he will be hung by one foot in this fashion for the crime of treason or stealing or some type of serious betrayal, right? The reason he appears awake, because just like in a wanted poster, the idea was to humiliate this person, right? You were supposed to know who this person was. That was the whole point. It was for humiliation, to bring his name down, to discredit his family. And I'm guessing that this individual was probably an enemy to the Visconti Sforza clan, or maybe within their own family, So for me, my interpretation of this young man, this image, right, is one of there's consequences for behaviors. There's consequences for indiscretions, And there also may be a bit of disgrace or humiliation involved. So that could also be a part of it. Now, that interpretation is one of the ones that I think varies greatly from how he became, this enlightened individual. Frankly, I think he became enlightened with a halo for no other reason other than the fact that he was a blonde. He appeared as a blonde in many of the decks, the previous decks. And I don't know if they completely disregarded the tradition of, this image and where it was born from, or they weren't aware of it. They certainly were not aware. If they were, if the occultists were promoting, a Egyptian agenda, it's possible they were completely unaware of where this image, began, as an Italian thing, right? And so, they attributed maybe different significance and meaning. And I think this is one of the cards where we clearly see that. Some people say he's sacrificed. It's a person who's being sacrificed. Well, I've never subscribed to that because, his consequence, or what the price he's paying, is of his own doing. And there's no real reference to Christ because Christ wasn't hung this way. In fact, Judas, was hung, maybe not by his foot, right? He hung himself, so it was suicide. But, the only, biblical reference that I can think of, where somebody is hanging, it would be Judas. And in fact, with the Minchiati Etruria, that may be a reference to their hanged men, with the appearance of sacks of coins. Those may have been reference to Judas, right? He was paid, right? And then we also have the same or similar image with the other Minchiati, this one, the Florentine. And then what appears to be, a rope that's dangling. At some point, the occultists, I think, presented, the figure of the hangman right side up, maybe because the VAV was known, because that's an upright hanged man, and maybe thought of it as a snake and assigned it, prudence. I did a blog article on that too. But then you see in the Italian tradition, continuing on with the Italian tradition, we clearly have, somebody who's hanging for a crime. Clearly it's a tree. Clearly it's a gallows. I think this image, is quite different, and it just, when using this deck, the images of like an enlightened person, a very, maybe a spiritual person, a person who's been sacrificed for some reason. But that's why I don't use this deck or these decks, very much, because I don't subscribe to their meanings. Like the origin stories don't jibe with my understanding of the cards. And this is one case, in point. I'll probably think of something else regarding the hangman, but I'm drawing a blank at the moment. But I think there is something else that I could say, but I just can't think of it. I remembered the point I was going to make as soon as I flipped the cards over. Because punishment, right, the hanging punishment, what follows that in the sequence is death. Now, at the time when the death image was created in the 1400s, I can't help but think that, that maybe it was a reference to the Black Plague. I mean, every time you turned around, the Black Plague was revisiting Europe. I mean, so many people died, and it had, it was a reality, right? I don't know that if the Black Plague was the only reason or the only thing that this card represented, but I think certainly people understood death and accepted it more regularly, than we do. People died a lot younger. I think in this deck, I don't know if this was the intended meaning. There could be multiple, but we see someone of privilege with a crown, and then someone without a crown. So death comes to everyone, and it's indiscriminate. When it's your time, it's your time. And, in the Italian tradition, he's got the scythe. Not much different here. And here, death is on a horse. And I think he's appeared on horses and other decks as well. A lot of times people don't want to identify death as death, but I think at the time when the cards were created, I think death, the image of death really did mean death. And although I would not, you know, in this day and age, if the death card popped up, say, oh my God, you're going to die, or somebody's going to die. But, you know, if other cards were in the sequence, in the spread, that were unfavorable, I would definitely caution, you know, the individual to, you know, be careful or to be mindful of behavior or whatever, you know, because death is an aspect of the death card. Now, I think you can comfortably recognize the death card as the end of something, you know, especially if, you know, like a cyclic card, like, you know, the Wheel of Fortune showed up, or, you know, like the Hermit showed up, you know, as far as time passing or whatever, and change, you know, being brought on. But, you know, I do think the lesson in the death card is one of caution. It's one aspect of it. And I think I'll stop on today's video with Temperance, because I'm getting tired, and maybe you are also. So with Temperance, we consistently across the board seem to have a woman who is transferring the contents of one vessel to another. In the Visconti Sforza deck, she has clothes that appear to have symbolic significance in the pattern. She stands before a crevice. And you can't really see the liquid exchange. Maybe it, you know, maybe you no longer can see it on the card or whatever, but it's understood, or it's, you know, your mind fills the gaps there. By the time of the TDM convert, we see a transference of liquid. She's a winged character, whereas she was not before. We have a winged character in the Soprafino doing the same thing. We do not have a winged character, but she is still doing the same thing. And then here we have a winged character of ambiguous gender, and the addition of the rainbow, which was not on the original Rider-Waite-Smith deck. Also the posture, 1 foot in water, 1 foot in land. I don't know that that was necessarily a thing with the other decks. It's a bit ambiguous here. We don't really know. And in these two decks, it's not a thing. In the Macchiata Etruria, transference from one vessel to another. As with the Metelli. And there is a posture, you know, reminiscent of 1 foot doing one thing and the other foot doing the other, but they're both on land. So, you know, all of the decks with this particular card seem to be communicating a very similar thought. In this Metelli, you know, it's a gold vessel into a silver vessel, which could signify, you know, two different substances, or two vessels for two different things, right? And I believe in all of the cards, the vessels are a bit different. So, you know, they could be vessels that were used for two different things, right? So, and the word temperance we associate with, you know, the temperate movement in the United States. But certainly I think the concept was, you know, as old as the hills, of maybe diluting the effects of something, right? So it's not as strong or as potent. It's a deliberate attempt to, you know, either change the intrinsic fiber of something or to dilute the effects of something. And I think that would be made clear during the reading. You know, if someone needs to hold back, the Temperance card might show up in combination with some other cards that could make you feel that way. Or if there's the idea that something new is you know, needs to be considered, we might have the Temperance, you know, showing the creation of a new fluid, right? A new thing. And that would be also indicated by some other cards that might appear with it. So I'm going to stop it here, friends. I hope this video has been instructful and insightful to you. And I'll try later today to create a fourth video whereby we finish the sequence of cards. It might be the last one may be a little longer. Until next time, friends, peace and stay well.